It's Women's History Month, and at Wikimedia UK, we're celebrating the great women and initiatives that are closing the gender gap on Wikipedia and its sister projects. Subscribe to see interviews every Monday and follow the links in the description for ways to get involved. Today, we're joined by Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Rebecca O'Neill, and I am the project coordinator for Wikimedia Community Ireland. I'm also a long-term Wikipedian. I've been editing English language Wikipedia for 10 years.
How is your project tackling the gender gap on Wikipedia and its sister projects?
So I can say that the very first article that I wrote on Wikipedia that was published was about a woman. It was a woman's biography about an Irish zoologist called Jane Stevens. And this was pre-Women in Red, and an awful lot of the discussions, there was kind of emergent discussions around the gender gap that had started to be identified. But since then, I was in the room in Mexico when Women in Red was started. I've been a member of it ever since. That was during my first 100 wiki days, when I wrote one article every day for 100 days consecutively in 2015, and a large proportion of those were biographies of women, and specifically about Irish women or women who have had an effect in Ireland through their work or their advocacy, that kind of thing. But within my work with Wikimedia Community Ireland, a huge amount of what we do will also address those kind of gaps, with obviously an Irish slant. So looking to both expand but also deepen the content related to Irish culture and Irish experience, but also specifically women's history and the experience of women in Ireland on Wikipedia, both in English and in Irish. One of our longest standing relationships is actually with a lecturer in University College Dublin, or UCD, Dr. Christo Fulton, who is in the Library Sciences and Information Studies department there. And since 2014, we have worked with second year students on information retrieval, and they use this to write or improve Wikipedia articles, now increasingly to improve them, to work on stubs. And each year we always make a conscious decision. We tend to take their historical biographies, so we tend to take a theme, so they might be writers or actors, or when we started first in 2014, an awful lot of the work was around what was referred to as the decade of centenaries in Ireland, so people who were involved in the events around 1916. An awful lot of the biographies, or an awful lot of the history of which, had obscured the female experience in kind of the preceding decade, and there was a lot of new research coming out. So the students were working to expand and deepen those existing kind of very slight articles that existed up until that point. And as I said, we've now kind of gone into sports people, poets, activists, politicians, that kind of thing. And we nearly always have a 50-50 divide on those. And we've noticed that the students do tend to lean towards the female biographies, which is great. So since its inception, we've also run a number of art and feminism events in Ireland each year. And we have a few perennial partners for that. So the National Gallery of Ireland, but also the library at Trinity College Dublin have run a number of events here when we were able to, focusing on the women related to their collections, with the National Gallery very specifically, obviously the artists that are represented in the collection, but also the sitters and donors associated with their collections. And that has been a very fruitful and a very interesting project to work with them, because it allowed them to meaningfully and kind of in ways that they hadn't thought about before, interrogate their collections in a kind of a new and in a way that allowed an outreach that they didn't really have available to them in past projects.
What would be most valuable to you to help your project to expand or increase its impact?
Really, it's like an awful lot of projects that would be access to good quality materials. And we're lucky now that in Ireland, the conversation is starting to move in that way. Our Dictionary of Irish Biography, which is curated by the Royal Irish Academy, is going to be going open access this year, which is going to be a huge boon. And it has been kind of quietly open access for the last year during the pandemic, which means that you kind of have access to the gold standard source material if you're writing about female biographies or Irish biographies in general. Also, we're seeing cultural institutions move towards open licensing. So the ability to illustrate these articles for a very long time, we have been quite reliant on UK and US institutions who perhaps hold collections relevant to Irish history for those kind of illustrative elements, which brings up kind of issues around representation and who is telling the story and through what lens an awful lot of these images are coming through. But thankfully, through many years and many stakeholders kind of talking about this Europeana and other activists in the area, that Irish institutions are starting to move in this direction. But I would say that you don't obviously have to be based in Ireland to write Irish content on English language Wikipedia. And there is, you know, if you go to the Women in Red or any of those kind of relevant projects, there are very long lists of Irish women that are still awaiting, both historical and contemporary figures. It's also been overlapped with projects like Black Matter. During that month, we saw some biographies being written about relevant people here in Ireland. So really it's, while I suppose Ireland has quite a high global profile for such a small country, it doesn't necessarily translate into well-represented or well-rounded articles on Wikipedia, not just about biographies, but about, I suppose, our historical experience in general. So if you have any sort of interest or access to any sort of resources, please on English language Wikipedia is a very welcoming space, and is always looking at, and very helpful editors are there. So there is the mentorship and support there if you're interested.
What are you most proud of?
So personally, I still have to say my article on Jane Stevens is still pretty up there. She was a relatively obscure figure when I first came across her when I worked in the Natural History Museum. But thankfully, due to other people's work, actually quite contemporaneous to when I came across her, a gentleman called John Lucy did very rigorous research into her and published an article about her, which then I could make then the justification for the article to be created, because she was kind of she was a borderline figure for a long time when I was drafting that first article. More recently, a woman that I came across that really piqued my interest was a woman called Kitty McCormack. And she's again kind of somewhat of a shadowy figure within a story that has been very dominated by the Yeats sisters, who were the sisters of W.B. Yeats. And they were involved in what was referred to as the Dining Guild, which was kind of this really arts and crafts endeavor where they were doing things like, you know, handcrafted bookbinding and tapestries, and very much kind of embedded in that, you know, kind of Morris type approach to handcraft. And they kind of had a schism with a woman called Evelyn Gleeson. And Kitty McCormack is her niece, and she kind of continues after Evelyn dies. She continues the guild for quite a number of years, but because the Yeats narrative is so dominant, you don't really hear about that particular point of history, or kind of how the Dunedin Guild progressed. And I was very lucky in that I was able to speak with, I think it would be his great aunt, so the gentleman who gave over a lot of collections relevant to the Dunedin Guild. I was able to speak with him about what he remembered of Kitty. And obviously none of this stuff makes its way into the Wikipedia article, but it's just kind of a wonderful feeling to get to know somebody who kind of feels very much on the margins and probably did the hard work and the hard slog day to day for, you know, a good 50 years, you know, most of her life. And speaking to academics in the space, I've kind of pointed out to them that there is this lacuna. So I'm kind of hoping that the effect that a lot of us suspect on Wikipedia, that if you have a Wikipedia article, then scholarly interest goes up because there's kind of a certain amount of exposure to a topic. So I always kind of hope that by creating these articles where perhaps it has been quite difficult to surface them in any kind of meaningful way, that will bring then more attention to them, and a bit like Jane, add levels of rigor and more sources and more information, and maybe even an image or two if we're really lucky and are really good.